science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk, this podcast which is dedicated to curating hopefully fascinating conversations on architecture and architectural thinking in dialogue with some of my best friends and interlocutors who can advance how we think about architecture. And what I wanted to say today was we have actually several fascinating conversations that are already recorded and being edited and coming up. But what we are doing today is releasing a composite, a episode that is condensed down from two conversations that I had with my very good friends, Tony Vidler and Mark Jazombek, separately. In anticipation of my upcoming Architecture Talk Live conversation on June 24th, 9 a.m. PST, on the question of the relevance or lack of relevance of mid-century Indian modernism today. Previewing that conversation, we are releasing this composite conversation, and I hope that today's re-engagement with this older conversation will move you to listen in on our panel discussion on 24th June at 9 a.m. You can know more about that if you go to www.mapinpub.com/webinar. All right, I hope you enjoy this. Here we go. What do you think about the valence of thinking in the era of, climate change and sustainability and sort of this extremely technologized and urgent sense
I think
of
it's both technologized and it's still Hegelian. In other words, it has this extraordinary effect of the big narrative.
Yeah.
So the big narrative that was progress in the Enlightenment, the big narrative that was the Hegelian dialectics of historical development towards a kind of philosophical community that was in Hegel, that got adopted as the kind of the structure of academic history,
right?
In art history and in all other histories. I still think that the chronological narratives of the Anthropocene, the chronological narratives of the catastrophe theories in relationship to climate change, which I think are absolutely correct,
of course,
and certainly worthy of complete panic, are in fact obscuring the possibilities of any form of mediatory action in the present.
Okay, what do you mean by that, mediatory action?
For example,
in the present?
There was a very nice little piece in Eflux the day before yesterday, maybe it was even yesterday, by a small group of architects and thinkers who were working between Eastern Europe and Rotterdam and Vienna in terms of thinking through what we do as architects as we are living the catastrophe and not awaiting the catastrophe.
Right. You think it sort of
I think
circumcises agency?
I think we already have already been in the catastrophe.
For a while, yeah.
Since industrialization.
Okay.
1800.
Yeah.
I think, in fact, we've always been already in the catastrophe, and that we've enabled certain populations to survive well, in terms of political influence, economic influence, and technological sophistication. We no longer are worried, not quite as worried as we were in Manchester as Engels was in terms of smoke pollution.
We're not?
Well, that's what I'm saying. We're no longer as worried.
Yeah,
right?
okay. But about the same.
But
yeah.
we are certainly worried in Mumbai.
Yeah, of course. And Delhi, yeah.
Not just smoke pollution, pollution of every other kind.
Yeah, of course, of course.
You burn off the crops. The crops have been anesthetized by chemicals, and the chemicals come back to haunt us in the city.
So you're saying this is an old discourse?
Totally.
Totally.
And I think in a way that the discourse of progress and the discourse of Hegelian dialectic is a discourse that was a defensive discourse.
Right.
Against something that was already there.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think in a way the first intimations of this sense of living the catastrophe are in something like Voltaire's essay on the Lisbon earthquake, or Diderot's.
Unpack that for us. Voltaire's essay on the Lisbon earthquake.
Well, how can we live under a God that rages so powerfully against us in nature? What is the relationship of nature if nature revolts so strongly against us while we ourselves are living in nature?
Yes.
Right? It's the beginning of volcano research. It's the beginning of what happened to Pompeii.
Right.
Nobody ever thought of what happened to Pompeii until the Lisbon earthquake.
Right. I
so
see.
For me, for me, modernity is the defensive realization that we are already on a course to a kind of auto-destruction, whether or not we know when it will be, or whether or not we know what it will be.
Right.
We know that it's not going to be kind.
Yes. Okay, if that's the case, then what is the project of Utopia? I mean, what are we fighting for?
Utopia is precise. No, I think the project of Utopia is precisely, on the one hand, as in Thomas More, it's a project of idealizing colonialization, of idealizing how one might in fact construct worlds outside the worlds we know, but which can in fact be constructed according to rules that Robinson Crusoe knew exactly how to do it. He established a nice little colonial operation
of course,
on his
right
island
on that
out of
two-person
Manfredi's first enslavement.
Right.
So I don't know.
So you're totally cynical about the Utopian
I'm not
project?
cynical.
Okay.
I'm historically critical.
All right.
It cannot be cynical about it.
Yes.
No.
Okay.
Utopia doesn't mean anything else but no place.
Yeah.
So
sure.
no place is just imagining whatever you want to imagine is going to happen.
No, but you're
in
saying it's a
some place.
specific, it's a colonial site.
I think so.
Yeah.
And it was actually demonstrated by the missionaries in Paraguay, for example, where they actually attempted to set up More's utopian civilization.
It's also the ethos of America, is it not? I mean, America itself.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. It's a settlement. Basically, Utopia is a settlement plan.
Yeah.
And if you go back
Laws of the Indies in some ways.
Well, if you go back to Plato, there's nothing in Plato that's not about Greek expansion. Defense of Athens and Athenian control of its provinces at a moment when that control is breaking down under the threat of the Persian Empire.
So you think the entire modernist narrative and ethos and ethic of progress is Hegelian?
No, I think the narrative that Hegel constructed a narrative that allowed for us to understand, allowed for us intellectuals to understand chronology as having a kind of motive, as opposed to just being one day after the next.
Okay.
Well, I mean, the dialectic of history for Hegel is towards a movement in, if you take the aesthetics, for example, you have the aesthetics which starts off with an architecture, which is, as he calls it, the symbolic moment, where a stone, which has never been called anything else, or has never been called anything before it's a stone, it doesn't exist before it's called a stone, is shaped and called something else, an altar. right, or a temple,
Right.
which leads to the possibility of building a big stone like a pyramid, which means the possibility of inhabiting that as a place to bury the dead, which leads to the possibility of building more stones, which you inhabit in order to worship the gods, which leads to his apotheosis, which is the romantic moment where there's a cathedral where the community of the Christian church can worship, where the form of the cathedral and the form of the worship and the form of the community are at one, at which point, with a little bit of help from philosophers, you don't need that anymore either.
Right. If I'm hearing you correctly, if you're theorizing contemporary practice which articulates itself as a response to the urgency of climate change, as a part of the repetitious Hegelian dialectic of the crisis of modernity, let's just say for shorthand, then
that's the narrative structure.
That's the narrative structure. But what is agency in this case?
In which we're taught to live.
In which we're taught to live. So what is architectural agency?
Precisely. Precisely. I feel that the concentration, I think, is important for students. I think it's important for all of us to register the fact that we're living within that narrative. That we're living the catastrophe. The catastrophe is not going to come. It's not about to come.
Yeah.
It's already with us.
Yeah.
So that the catastrophe has to be lived in such a way. I mean, Donna Haraway has developed one form of understanding of living with the troubles. Right. I would say that the problem is with architecture is that architecture has always had a narrative which has an agency within its discipline, from Vitruvius to the repetition of Vitruvius and the reduplication and the transformation of Vitruvius in the Renaissance, all the way through. It has its historical roots, and it has its historical continuous transformations, right? So that Beaux-Arts transformation of an 18th century Vitruvian discourse can be understood in compositional terms, which then in compositional terms can be transformed into taking historical types and recomposing them, so that we can still see someone like Jim Sterling in the Leicester engineering building,
right,
looking at Melnikov and using Melnikov and
right,
thinking he's part of a tradition,
right,
but also some thinking also, and he writes this, of making more complex and more immediate the language of modernity, the language of modern architecture. So, having, I think, lost that particular connection to a historical discipline, we're now plunged into the big narrative,
right,
and we are given various technological apparatuses to either counter the narrative or to analyze the narrative, right? And I don't think that that's enough for architecture. And I think that we're in a moment now where we have to actually scale down.
Scale down?
Yes.
What do you mean?
We have to scale down. We have to understand that architecture is not going to solve a crisis that or a catastrophe that we're living in.
Right.
But it has a role in mediating on the one hand, the extraordinary power of the technological instruments that are being put together by cooperatives and by engineers and by scientists in order to counter the catastrophe. There's not a single architect in those cooperatives.
Okay.
And
so you're saying that's the appropriate site for that response?
What I'm saying, well, it could be one of the interesting things about the little Eflux article I read the day before yesterday, is that they are talking about, yes, they're living in a catastrophe. What can you do? You can't just sit back, and you can't develop business as usual. You have to establish resistance in relationship to cooperating with a group of resistors who are in localities,
right,
and at the same time try to enter the discussion as architects and designers of the engineers and the technologists who are claiming that they are going to be able to solve the crisis.
So architects as citizens, as community members, and also as providers of partial solutions.
As designers.
As designers,
Yes.
yeah. So as
I was particularly moved when I went to Yale in April for a symposium, brought a group of experts and architects around the Japanese condition from Hiroshima to Fukushima. It was something like resistance and resilience as a symposium.
Okay.
And I was particularly moved by the narratives of the group Bow Wow that came.
Yeah.
And who talked about the way in which they had been energized to enter the territory of after the Fukushima nuclear and tsunami.
Yeah.
Right? Finding a community which was a survival community, which was the shattered pieces of communities that had bonded already together because the bureaucracy had been completely slow and ineffectual and so on. They'd already bonded for survival in the way in which they found and sourced goods that were stored somewhere else, and where little grocers said, yeah, we have a depot back in here, we can bring untainted goods and so on.
Urgent, almost situationist.
Yeah. Urgent situationist.
Yeah.
And that then talking to that community, which basically said, we don't want to go back to where we were.
Right.
We now are a different community.
Yeah.
Right? And being able to source materials for building and ways of constructing temporary shelters for community activities, for habitat, in such ways that not only could they not be temporary, they could extend,
right,
but also it was not just disaster housing, it was not just temporary shelter, it was an architecture which bonded with the needs of a particular group of survivors.
Right.
And to me, one could actually begin to think architecture not just in terms of survival, not just in terms of sort of catastrophe,
disaster response,
but in terms of developing material and spatial prototypes for living the disaster.
Interesting.
Living the catastrophe.
Living the disaster, living the catastrophe.
Which we're in.
Yes.
My interest in Utopia, I have to say, interest in Utopia was sparked in the 70s, the late 60s and early 70s, in a small group in London with Martin Pauly, the critic, and with others who were, we were absolutely amazed at the hubris of architects who thought that architecture could reconstruct society. The hubris of that kind of utopianism.
Sure, yeah,
where architecture was the right. So my first efforts at unpacking that particular hubris were Fourier and Ledoux.
Right.
I don't idealize either of them, but I do think that both of them are, in some way or another, keys to the kind of kernel keys to the basic false utopianism of architecture.
What do you mean by that?
That architecture can construct and transform society by itself.
Right.
That you put people in the unité d'habitation and think they're going to be nice.
But return to Ledoux and Fourier. I mean, so what are you saying about that?
They are the theorists of that
kind of thinking,
of that
thought.
Of that thought.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So I'm not someone who, talks. In the postmodern era, I was always thought of as somebody who talked about Ledoux because I thought he was a wonderful visionary.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I was talking about.
That's what happens when you write the canonical sort of book on the Enlightenment of architecture.
Right, but at the same time, my Enlightenment is deeply inflected by Foucault's Enlightenment, which is
of course,
the dark side of rationalization and rationalism. Right. So it's Adorno after the Holocaust.
Right. So you're seeing postmodernism conventionally thought as sort of the semiotic branding semiotic, representational strategy as a kind of a particular ideological branding
Well,
of modernism.
I think that the name postmodern, which my friend Charles, the late lamented Charles, was a very good friend. I always felt that he, because he was trained, by Banham was trained by Pevsner, he was trained by Banham. They all were trained in an art historical mode of having to label something. And to label something kills it.
Right.
And it actually kills it as a thought process.
Right.
Right. So I
agree.
I don't want to
absolutely.
think of. I don't think of Frank Gehry and Venturi, and I don't want to think of them as not contemporary, as not modern. I mean, they are all part of. Peter Eisman is as much postmodern as anybody else.
Sure.
Right. I mean, if you think of postmodern as an art historical identification of something after what art history has already called modernism.
Yeah.
Which is crazy anyway.
Yeah.
Because if you're talking about modernism, you're talking about the most incredibly small aspect of, or the tiny aspect of what happened in the 20s and 30s. I mean, are you going to talk about modernism and Tessenhoff? Are you going to talk about modernism and Tautz? And the notion of the modern movement, the notion of modernism, the motion, and the way in which they've all become crystallized in courses,
right?
Theory courses, which autonomize. These poor graduate students that have to read Deleuze without having a single notion that Deleuze on the Fold is talking about Leibniz. I mean, how can that's okay if you're a philosopher, if you have some kind of intercepted philosophy.
Yeah.
But to just take it as a diagram that allows you to play with curves in parametric formation, it's nothing to do with that. So I'm against the autonomization of these strands of thinking.
Right. But you said once earlier in our conversation, we've resolved our quarrel, or whatever you want to call it, with art history. You seem to suggest that we have kind of got beyond that. What did you mean by that?
Oh, I still feel that the relationships between architectural history as a discipline and art history as a discipline are problematic.
Right. Yes.
That's all I can say. I mean, there are art historians who overcome the problematic, and there are architectural historians who overcome the problematic.
Right.
But in relationship to someone like myself, who is trained as an architect,
right,
and who think like an architect, in relationship to all the questions that architecture has to ask, the isolation of those aesthetically, or in temporal periodization, or in stylistic formations, or in any way, cuts up the possibility of thinking holistically about it, even the building.
Right. Okay, as we move towards the end over here, so having now stepped down as dean at Cooper Union and traveling between several institutions, what are you working on now? What's on your keyboard, or what's keeping you awake?
What keeps me awake is all the questions that my students ask me. That's the one thing.
Right.
And I can never actually resolve or solve how they, to any extent of, and I don't want to resolve those questions.
Right.
Those are questions that are legitimately asked,
right,
and legitimately should remain questions.
Right.
I've never in my life ever set out to write a book, so I write always on invitation, stimulation, and pressure. So somebody asks me to do something as an article or as a commentary, I always resist. I say, I know nothing about this. I can't do this.
Yeah.
And then I say, okay, well, maybe I'll do it. And eventually, after several deadlines are missed, I will produce the article.
Uh-huh.
Over a period of years, sometimes 3 or 4 years, sometimes 5 years. With the 18th century, it was like 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
I look back on what I've written and published and think, there's something that unifies these different articles or these different things, which is what I was interested in at that moment.
Right.
Whether it was 18th century Enlightenment, whether it was just investigating this strange character, Ledoux,
Uh-huh.
which I still haven't pinned him down. Whether it was investigating the incredible, trying to decipher the extraordinary handwriting on thousands and thousands of pieces of paper that Charles Fourier produced in his archive.
Yeah.
Whether it was in contact with people in Princeton who were deeply involved in, a kind of post-Freudian Lacanian discourse of psychoanalysis and trying to test out whether or not there was something in architectural discourse, certainly in textual discourse, that resonated. And why was it that Freud's case studies were always based on short stories?
Uh-huh.
And why are those short stories about spaces and Roman ruins?
Yeah.
Or whether it was trying to come to grips with the technological revolution of parametrics and the strange forms that were emerging out of that in terms of spatial structures that were certainly not the spatial structures of rationalism that I had become attuned to and taught to design in warped space, or whether it was a series of reflections on the different historians and critics that had influenced me in my life.
Mm-hmm.
All those books came out of a series of articles that suddenly seemed to me, not suddenly, maybe over a year, teasing out the relationships among them were formed into a book.
Right.
So what I'm doing now is I'm writing articles and hoping that in the next
the dots will
few
connect.
years there's some thread which is about some thread which is about the notion of atomic, post-war, post-Second World War architectural thought and practice, which has unified certainly a lot of the articles I've published in the last 4 or 5 years. Questions of bombing, questions of ruins, questions of memory, questions of dystopia, questions of fear, of trauma, of post-atomic trauma. So, at one moment, I'm sure I will find a way of bringing those articles into some form. Ideally, I want them to be a kind of riposte, or if you like, a conclusion or a continuation. Let's say nothing's ever concluded. In the same way that Banham's Theories in Design in the First Machine Age was a response to the refusal of his professor Pevsner's to go beyond 1914, and so he went to 1939. I don't find a work of theory of, let's take out the word theory, of architectural thought in relationship to post-World War II, post-atomic conditions, post-nuclear, post-Holocaust conditions, that touches those architects and theorists and thinkers about architecture in the same way that Banham touched the theorists and thinkers about architecture from the First World War to the Second World War. So I hope, in a way, that it will be a continuation, if you like, of work, not about the architects of postmodernism or the architects of the post-war, but about architecture post-war.
Right. Well, we will look forward to that.
I do too.
Thank you. Thank you for
I hope it never finishes anyway.
I hope it never finishes anyway. It will never finish. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for all your work and your friendship, Tony. It's been such a pleasure.
Me too.
We now transition to a conversation between Vikram and Mark Jarzembek, professor of the History and Theory of Architecture at MIT. This conversation focuses on the status of the Global History Project, a project whose mission is to rework the Eurocentric approach to architectural history, favoring instead a more inclusive global vision, with underlying themes of post-colonial and post-structural theories. Here we go.
Well, welcome to Architecture Talk again, Mark.
Thank you for having me back. It's always a pleasure to speak to you.
So today I was doing one of your GAHTC lectures on the Magdalenian culture and civilization.
Oh, the caves.
And I also, the caves, and I
Yeah.
also overlapped it with the discussion of the Gravettians and the northern hunting tradition and the
Yep.
differences between the Lavus and the Tipis.
Yeah.
And I had a great time in class, sort of revisiting this first society's discussion that we had in our very first conversation on Architecture Talk. But like we discussed, I thought today, we should have a much more, or like you said, a two-way conversation. This is like you and me chatting, right?
Yep.
And I thought it'd be, great. Let's try and talk about the meanings and purports, of course, but also the, if you like, ambitions and unknown ambitions of our global project. Yeah. Which is to say, now we have been at this. Well, we started with the textbook, which was 15 years ago. 15 years ago?
Oh, more, right?
18 years ago.
18 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, 18 years ago. Book's been published about 15 years, and that's in its third edition. And now for the last 6 years, we have been running this global architectural history teaching collective, very generously funded by the Mellon, which I'm starting to feel comfortable calling a success now that
Yeah.
we have pretty good membership, lots of people in it. Where can we take this? Are we taking this simply to take over and amplify the teaching of history in schools of architecture? Or is it a broader thinking? I mean, it seems to me that in the 21st century, this is sort of it's part of a spectrum in the world today, which is looking to move out of the modern, right, and become after modern, modern Enlightenment classic, in some way. That with the new horizons of being in the world, with the kind of imminence of climate change, I would like to say at this point, with the almost presence of artificial intelligence, with the sort of significant and continuing erasure of the nation state, broad spectrum challenges to patriarchy, and with, from my perspective, the kind of fantastic advancements in the frontiers of astrophysics and our understanding of our place in the continuing understanding of our place or lack of place in the universe, and with globalization, globalization with all its complexities. With these sort of what are considered to be the big questions of our time, the sort of urgent questions, urgent problems. I would like to be able to think that in some ways the quest of the global project contributes to those registers in some way.
Yeah. Let me go back to your idea about after the modern. What do you sort of mean a little bit by that? Because I know you don't mean just postmodernism, but
Yeah,
what, in other words, is global climate problem, a scale that the modern just can't understand anymore? In other words, is it the scale?
right.
Modern claimed a
Yeah.
certain universalism, it claimed big scale, but ultimately it gets undone by the overscale being right of the global climate problem, the collapse of the nation state ideologies, and so forth and so on, right? So these are global problems, right? Because everyone is sort of now
Right.
enmeshed in these, whether we like it or not. Is that what you mean by after the modern? That the modern is, we have to sort of give up?
What I think is that the project that was inaugurated around a modern subjectivity, which invested its faith in the idea that a stable slash universal human subjectivity could be deployed to solve and know and understand the world and the universe in a manner that would at some point in the not too distant future be like a done project, has
Right, that's right.
through its own investigations found itself to be it found itself to be an impossible project. And so it requires us, modernist project itself requires its if you like annihilation in the search for other after modern projects, other after modern subjectivities, ways of being in the world and ways of knowing the world.
So we can think of the modern project, its production of certain type of subjectivities and abstractions
Right.
and these things that you talked about.
Hmm.
But we also know
Hmm.
that, from the beginning, all of these
Right.
were constructed. All of these became corrupted, both literally and figuratively, right? There's no such thing as uh,
Hmm.
the modern without its corruptions. So these things are really, one produces in some sense
Right.
the other. So the the critique of the modern is not the critique of this strange
Hmm.
its imminent collapse, right, but of its sort of transcendent collapse. And so I'm trying to sort of say that, in other words, it's the modern already was destined to collapse
Right.
under the
Premises.
falsification of its own ambition. So okay, so we can imagine, I mean, just take any modernization project, anywhere in the world, and 100% it's connected to capitalist
Hmm.
corruption, right? So I mean, just literally, right? So as a sort of the figurative example of all modernism, uh, you know, slated towards a teleological project that is
All
actually
right.
producing the opposite, right? A sort of a divorce, towards
Mhm.
some other chaotic
So you're reading
realities, right?
capitalism as the inevitable
So,
corruption of modernism.
well, I'm reading. I guess I'm sort of saying I'm reading modernism
Hmm.
as a
Hmm.
dualism. So it's 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 going to be the good and the bad, if you will, together in equal doses. So in other words, it produces these negations that it then uses
Hmm.
to substantiate itself all the more. and vice versa. The more it substantiates itself, the more the critique
I
develops
see.
and says we need something else. Right. So it's a little bit the cat or the dog chasing its
And
tail.
you don't mean this in a Hegelian way,
It
right?
just
Or do you mean it in a Hegelian way?
no, not a
Okay.
Hegelian dialectic, right? In other words, there's no destruction at the end of this that produces
There
the
is no
next thing,
sublation.
right? Right. There's no sublation, right? So it sort of just gets tighter and tighter, or the dog runs faster and faster until perhaps there are these sort of extreme formations that sort of veer out, in a way, around this. But some form of, let's say, let's say, China using AI to monitor its entire population, right? So, in some sense, where there's no place to hide, except everything's hidden.
Right.
So in other words, in a funny way, it reproduces that problem at an even more massive scale, and it's not destined to last because ultimately it's going to collapse, and it's not that it's going to collapse through making that which is hidden visible. It's just going to collapse into other formations of that which is empowered and that which is sort of disempowered, right? Whether it's perhaps in more local worlds, right, or
Okay.
not. So anyway, just to conclude, I'm just sort of saying that the critique of in other words, in this sort of spinning vortex, how does one establish a critique that, in some sense, doesn't entrap one either as one enters into it for being complicit in one side of the game or the other side of the game, right? Because as a scholar, as an intellectual, as a person living where I live, it could look like I'm pretty much, by my positioning, all a modern subject,
Yeah, but even the
right?
desire to not enter into the discussion, quote and so to say, objectively, is already a modernist position.
Yeah, that's right. Right. So where does one enter is just as much a question as how does one, I guess you could sort of say, exit out of the modern.
Yes.
See what I'm saying? In other words, because how you enter it's a semi-subject position question that you have to sort of take pretty seriously. Without that, it becomes either deadening, which is quite possible. You just sort of give up. It just whatever it is, right? Or you enter a series of predestined paths of critique. All globalization is some sort of
Right.
evil, right? And we have to critique evil. We have to critique globalization because it's sort of the determinant paradigm of oppression. Whereas, I'm flying all over the world and giving lectures here. Globalization is, without globalization, I wouldn't have a career, right? Right. So, it's completely hypocrisy to pronounce some sort of radical critique and then not perform it, very consistently. So all of us are extremely inconsistent in this critique. So that's what I'm sort of saying, how we enter in is part of the problem. And that's where I think global, getting back to the core issue, is a sort of an entry mechanism rather than an exit mechanism.
And I would agree with that. And when I said after modernism, I mean two or three things. One of the I don't think of it as a kind of an exit process. I mean, it's not a. I don't. I'm not looking, in a sense, for a door out into another room. Perhaps it is another room, but the after modern is for me two things in the kind of issues that you are raising, which is that it is still, I am quite committed, if you like, to the modernist project. And I see
Mhm,
the after modern project in that sense still a modern project,
mhm, mhm.
uh, but not a modern project, one that finds itself questioning its own construction and even foundations.
Mhm. That's
So
right.
it's a bad term, after modern, and I
Yes.
perhaps don't like even postmodern. So whatever the term is, but it's for my head, it's still very much a modernist project in that sense.
Except that I think in your reading of it, it has to be another word that might come to fore here, but it's equally weirdly weird about it is sort of
Hmm.
ethics, because at some moment you have to make ethical decisions about where the modern is still modern in a way that's
Right.
productive to critical position, and in the way and where it gives you unbeknownst or beknownst or unbeknownst certain
Hmm.
illegitimate rights and powers, and some of those you simply can't
Hmm.
um, stop, right? You and I and basically all the millions of people around me, right, are complicit in the destruction of native
Right.
resources, native cultures, the destruction of
Right.
languages and environments all around, right? So we, in some sense, know that, but God, what are we actually are going to do about it? So some of us go and live in Vermont, some join political action campaigns, some just watch it what they buy at the store. I mean, there are, you know, hundreds of different solutions. Some
Right.
basically.
So it's the question of your own personal agency, given the sort of larger narrative of society and politics and history.
There is, that's right, yeah, and you have to be comfortable with that, and you have to be comfortable also with the challenges that are coming from those who have made more profound, have developed more profound
Hmm.
takes on the problem, right? So in
Hmm.
other words, I give money to Greenpeace, but I'm not out there on a
Right.
boat stopping the whaling. Now, someone could say, well, that's just,
Hmm.
liberal, greenwashing. And I'd have to
No,
say,
no,
yep,
no, no, no.
it
Let's not
is.
quickly move over
I
that, because
no.
in the span of your life is limited, and you only have that much time and that much agency. Uh, so the question is, and all projects, all agency. I mean, to one of the learnings of kind of late this sort of after modernism is that all individual agency is only uh, uh, socially inscribed, right? Which is to say, uh,
That's
all
right.
doings, all projects, all things we put together, even all authorship, can only be known and constructed as part of a broader matrix. So $50 to Greenpeace is can be recognized to be a part of that, which is unless the rest of your life you spend your time cutting down trees and building homes, right? But you could be
True.
doing a
Yeah,
lot of other things,
right.
uh, and in that sense, in the time and effort you have and the kind of agency you are available to you, uh, we are all pulling hopefully in the same direction of the boat. So I mean, I would not be comfortable with the sort of, so the question of ethics remains. I agree, uh, but the but that question of ethics cannot be reduced completely to a Marxist materialist kind of a position, wherein certain questions or certain kind of agencies are unquestionably of much higher value than others.
Right. So yeah, I agree. In other words, the question of ethics does not mean that there is an ethical mandate of some sort of um, clear, identifiable, rationally
Right,
describable world, right? That says
right.
this is what you should be doing, right? So in other words, that would
Yes, that's
be
right.
the
Yeah,
old modern, right? So to speak, right? What point of view, right? There's a sort of a ethical approach, and you've got to be ethical. I mean,
right.
or else, right?
Ethical in a particular way. Yeah, yeah,
Whereas the question of ethics,
yeah.
yeah, ethical in a particular way. That's right. Yeah, and this is largely the shadowy terror
Right.
of
Okay.
monotheism, in my view. The question of if the question of ethics, right, is something that is more haunting
Hmm.
to the subject position, because you have to find the question in places where you don't expect it
Or you find,
or you
you
don't
don't
look
have
for
to
it,
find it. You
and
find
that
it in places where you don't expect it. Yeah,
yeah, that's right. You do.
yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. You do find it, but you also have, one sense to sort of have a opening or a sensitivity towards
Hmm.
understanding that that is a question, because you may not know that it's a question until someone tells you it's a question, or somehow you find out that it's a question through reading or
Right,
learning or
right.
whatever it is, learning about the world, right? So once again, if I can just pop in that
Hmm.
our complicated world, global, I think global is one of these words that allows that opening, among other things, the opening of the question of ethics to become more
Right,
visible in different ways. Admittedly, largely through the question of, well,
right,
what is
right.
history, right, as opposed to what is the value of whales in the Pacific. But that the question of history is an equally important problem, right, as to when and where and how do we value that which comes before us.
So, would you say that the global as a term, as a uh, let's say epistemology and ethics opening term, is necessarily only historical, or is it also, philosophical and epistemological? Uh, is it a history question only, or is it also, can it also be described, let's say, from my perspective, as a turning towards science and let's say planetary thinking and astrophysics?
I'm with you 100%. I'm right behind you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So,
No, I mean, I love that
yes,
you're
yes.
pushing it in that direction. It's certainly, you know, um, it's certainly, I think, one of the things that I like about your contribution to that, because I that's something that I would have gravitated toward
Hmm.
by myself, or just on my own, right? Because I would have probably insisted on the sort
Yes.
of the history part of it.
Even if you, even the word phenomenologies of being in the world that are made available by thinking about other uh, histories, and that global history opens up, uh, to access those is not simply a history question. It is also a question, uh, it is paralleled by, it is paralleled and possibly intersected by the kind of, if you like, craziness which is emerging when one starts thinking about the
Mhm.
world as quantum and isotropic as in astrophysics.
Yes, yes, I can definitely see it. I mean, I think that it opens up the problem of our, I don't know, the scale, the weird anomaly of the human world within these larger, quote unquote larger, but could be also molecularly small environments, which define us in some very profound way.
Yes. No, they don't define us. We are all made of quantum. The entire,
Yeah.
this
Okay.
is not everything
All
that
right.
is in the world is what is poorly called particles. And particles are actually vibrations of some kind. Uh, and
Uh-huh.
so the questions that are posed by that, and the sort of profound difficulty uh, of the quantum world's relationship with the uncertainty present in what is known as uncertainty is what gives rise to
Mm-hmm.
quantum possibilities, uh, is fantastically, I think, intractably connected with the idea, with not the idea, with the act of knowing, uh, as Karen Barad has argued in Meeting the Universe Halfway, in a manner that is that to be able to start to access what that means and what its implications are, maybe something that the people in Lascaux and Chauvet perhaps knew to a certain extent better than we do now. So that's the sort of connection I'm trying to hope to make.
At the beginning, um, I sort of pointed out that the modern was sort of trapped in its own vortex of its own anti-modern, right? The modern and anti-modern, it's hard to tell which
Hmm.
is one and the other, right? There's a sort of a dualism at play. So one could either imagine that this dualism is, in other words, not a dualism
Hmm.
because it's an entrapped dualism, right? It's always one on the other, right? So we could imagine a harmony of that, which would be sort of a yin yang, but this would
Okay.
be the eternal disharmony of that, right? So then there's the transcendence of dualism in the figure of in the world of some aspects of Hinduism, with Shiva, right? So the where
Hmm.
non-duality, in particular, let's say the non-duality of gender, right, is
Hmm.
seen as no the truth, right?
Hmm.
Where duality is seen as sort of
Hmm.
the world of human suffering through duality, right? Is for you
Hmm.
the interest in science a space of non-duality?
uh, I'm attracted to contemporary theory on science as I was attracted to contemporary French critical theory when it articulates itself in a way as trying to overcome the dualities of classical modernist thinking, yes, or classical Abrahamic thinking, yes. I mean, to a certain extent, a clear bias in my thinking is comes from the huge bias comes from Derrida, from reading Derrida, and who Habermas, if you remember, basically called him a renegade rabbi, right?
Mhm.
Habermas, right?
Of course,
Uh,
yeah.
because all this business of
Yep.
reading from the margins is like Kabbalah, right? All this business, there are a lot of sort of the text and the word and the texare and il n'y a pas hors du text, this sort of all these sort of thinkings that come out of him. And his first cousin, the entire psychoanalytic universe, uh, uh, with all its again push towards non-dualities and role of the unconscious and subconscious and so on, can be said to be is your world, your Jewish mysticism stuff, right? So my first attraction towards contemporary new materialism, in particular Karen Barad, who I've cited to you, uh, is through its recognition as being a derivation of French post structuralism, which has, uh, Habermas called it renegade Judaism, but has for a long time also been connected to Buddhist thinking, like you are describing it to be. This idea of non-duality in the Buddhist
Mhm.
way as shunyata are concepts that do connect in to post-structuralist psychoanalytic thinking. So, so in that sense, I
Mhm.
think one of the things that we have learned is that old Judaic stuff does interconnect with old Hindu stuff in modern global ways. Isn't that what global is?
Indeed, indeed. I think that um, you're right, and I think in one sense, it just goes to show there are different ways to, you know, cut the fish, right? I mean, you can't. There's no one global that's going to fit all purposes. You got to,
Yeah.
and maybe getting back to the question of entry or exit, you know, maybe the entry, in other words, your biography gave you a certain entry. Well, in other words, your biography might have produced for you a desire for exit, but in a odd way, because of the way you approach the problem, it
Uh-huh.
allowed you also a re-entry that through, let's say, the ancillary project of
Hmm.
reading, analytics, self-critique, and these type of things, right, allowed you to, in some sense, sort of return to
Hmm.
the discomfort of I don't want to say origin, but but discomfort of
Right.
of the autobiography. Without that, it becomes itself explanatory, right? It is something that can be denied, but at the
Hmm.
same time, it is material that your subconscious uses in order to frame
Right.
its operations of critique.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, this
and
is a
yeah,
this is one of the key kind of uh, the sort of psychoanalytic post-structuralist, post-colonial framings of knowledge, which is that uh, autobiography, or which is to say history, is not a matter of stories of origin. It's a matter of the inevitable uh, inevitable sort of residue, inevitable sort of presence in a palimpsestic way in whatever you are doing today of that in the present, not in a sort of simple,
that's right. That's right.
because you are Hindu, therefore you think Shiva had it right, may, but in the sort of in the frameworks, actings, agencies of things like desire, uh, is an inevitable thing.
Mhm.
The modernist, some kind of
Mhm.
a modernist political form, seems to me to be the democratic liberal,
Mhm.
form seems to me to be good enough and adequate,
Mhm. Mhm.
a framework from within which to pose and think through philosophy, physics, science, and history. Uh,
Okay, but let me interrupt. If we think of the modern nation state, I mean, as a sort of I'm adding the nation state, but the word modern, nation state as a type of
mhm,
symptomatic practice of what we might call the modern, right? Right. One of the things the modern nation state has to do, this is especially in Asia and India for sure, right, is sort of
right.
solve the problem of the periphery, which is the problem of the tribal, the first societies, the mountain people, the hill people, whatever you want to call those people, right? Right. And it does that in extremely brutal ways. That, yeah, okay. So, but these ways that it does this are called law, education, job programs, and so forth and so on, right? They're no longer enslaved. They're no longer necessarily brutalized in the traditional sense of how you might sort of deal with so-called these people that were called primitives or savages, right? So now the nation state comes and says, okay, you're going to have to be on, go to work in a factory. You're going to have a bank account. You're going to have to have languages. You're going to have all these type of things, right? And it does all of that in a very constructedly half-assed way to make sure that these people remain sort of disempowered within the very structure of power.
Well, yes and no. I mean, obviously, I'm not defending the.
No. I'm not saying you are. I'm not saying you are. I'm just sort of saying now that if one basically sees in other words, the teleology of the modern is that this is just going to be a transition until finally everyone is accounted for, and then we're done. My point here is that temporal zone, or maybe the geopolitical zone, is the zone of a tough Holocaust. You may think that's too extreme, but I'm sort of saying that the Jewish Holocaust, where people were, burnt in the oven, was in some sense a formation of that went into the extreme, but is not any different in terms of where the arrows are pointing from the nation state's attempt to deal with its marginal populations.
I think if the modernist liberal project is defined as creating a singular universal subjectivity, which necessarily involves, therefore, the elimination of all subjectivities that are not considered to be universal, which is certainly a version of the formation of the modernist project, then yes. But if we more loosely define the modernist project as the project of representation and the securing the rights to be present in the parliament of united humanity, not united, but sort of, or, the liberal democracy, not democracy, the liberal representation project in general, then the critique that the modernist project, that the nation state's silencing of non-modernist voices, that critique, that the nation state silenced non-modernist voices, that critique still is done from the liberal position that those voices deserve to be heard. So
Correct.
so the
Yes,
nation state as a political formation, I can agree that the Nehruvian state in that sense, as articulated, can be connected to, so one can see the Nazis as a subversion of the modernist nation state, if that's what you're arguing. But its critiques, its directions as political formations, as social political formation, is still a position that I think the liberal position of the necessity of enabling proper representation is still a valid enough position for me.
And I think I would also agree with that. I just would say that added, to the problem, right, is the is the difference, if you will, between and this gets a little bit to my emerging, I don't know, problem a little bit with Derrida, right? Between a writing centric and an oral centric worldviews. So, Derrida critiques orality as the logos, problem, against which there is no possibility of critique because it sort of speaks and it pronounces itself, right? Whereas as soon as things come down in writing, you can begin to trace uh, the the problems, right? Because you need writing and in some sense to sort of find the archive of problematic. Yeah, exactly. Right. So it basically the Jewish medieval project against sort of the early Judaic Yahweh as logos project. And I've been really, interested in now we deal what happens then about, I think that his misreading of orality is in other words, there's other types of, let's say, orality rather than the orality that's written down as spoken by God making pronouncements. So what we have in, let's say, non-modern worlds is a plethora of, and non-Western in particular, that's right, a plethora of other forms of oralities that simply don't fit into anything that a nation state can do because nation state has got to put everything down in writing. And so the only way to, solve that, right, is to, in some sense, muscle the written world into everything. Then you can, of course, establish then the post facto critique. But this is maybe once again where that sort of initial question about, well, where does the ethical find itself, right? In worlds that are not silent as such, but are silent to the nation state, because the nation state doesn't have Buddha's ear to the ground. Nation state has got a computer and typewriting, right, and bureaucracies and ledgers and textbooks and whatever, law, constitutional rules and stuff like that, right? So getting back to, Buddha's ear question, where does, that there's a sort of a border issue between the written and the oral world that I think the global needs to understand and figure that out a little bit.
I have always read Derrida's critique of orality as specifically from within the Western Abrahamic tradition, which a particular medieval condition, as you said, which thinks of orality as connected to the soul in a particular way, into a singular origin-based subjectivity, and so it's a critique of that thinking, which present in modern culture as the signature and the sign of a unified subject. Uh, I think that critique, it would be perilous, yes, I agree with you, to apply that critique, therefore, to all orality, including not just non-Western oralities or the Buddha's ears, but also, ancient oralities and Chauvet oralities and various kinds of oralities. But that project remains, that's the global history project, that's the project you and I are doing, because we can now, because you and I function in the haloed institutions of Western civ, uh, there is this space in these haloed institutions. Traditionally, the truth of being in the sort of Western subjectivity sense was to be privileged. Now, if that is deprivileged or decentered, then there is the space created to articulate other Buddha ear to the ground oralities. But these need to be known.
Yes. No, I think you clarify that very well. I think Derrida is basically saying that, in some sense, phonocentrism was, if I don't want to say manipulated, or was exploited by monotheism to produce a privileged, self-expressive subject positioning.
Right.
That is a sort of a dead-end street. Right. But therefore writing is the way you can
context,
work around that.
Yeah.
Right. Because writing, yes, that's right. Right. And it's not just writing down, but the writing on writing and writing on writing on writing. In other words, the iterativeness of writing, the non-endingness that allows critique to find its ways in the gaps and fissures, could only happen once you start writing, because then it sort of doesn't ever, it can never find its sort of teleological claims that even it's written about. So, but there is let's say the box that falls off at the back of the truck, that this is a wholesale critique of orality, which would be probably wrong. I mean, I don't know if he's ever talked about what his views are on.
He often put in between. He put many times in his
what did
text,
he say?
In Western civilization. And once, I think once he was asked about its possible connections to Buddhist thinking, and he said, that sounds interesting, but I don't really know anything about it.
Yeah.
I mean, he just,
Okay. Well, I'm glad he said that, but it also shows, in some sense, the limitation of his critique in these other contexts, right? So, and it also reverses the charges in some sense, because if you go to places with very strong, what we would call oral traditions, it's actually writing centrism that is a teleological problem. Right? It's almost the opposite, because as soon as writing comes in, it corrodes, purposefully corrodes, the complicated oral communicative structures that humans have developed between each other, between themselves and the landscape and nature, between the birds and the rocks, and all these type of things, right? And writing basically erases that completely.
Right. All right. Thanks for being a partner on Architecture Talk.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.